The entire town mocked them, as the silent veteran and his limping dog built a bizarre round house in the dead of winter. But why would a combat engineer like Jack endure hunger and exhaustion just to raise a concrete dome that everyone called a tomb? What was the real secret he and his dog Cooper were hiding beneath that foundation? When the superstorm erased every square house, the truth revealed will leave you speechless. The compassion of a man turned away by the world will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe. The Wyoming wind roared with a jagged crystalline edge, whipping the first dry flakes of winter against the dark, frozen pines. Leaden clouds descended from the peaks like a heavy curtain, turning the afternoon into a bruised, sunless twilight. Below, the town of Clearcut huddled in the valley, its timber buildings shivering against the oncoming frost. Jack Miller stepped off the rusted Greyhound bus, the sole passenger to disembark into the biting cold of the mountain station. At 46, he carried the rigid, unyielding posture of a man forged in fire, his broad shoulders slightly hunched against the gale under a heavy, oil-stained canvas jacket. His face was a weathered map of silent wars. A jagged silver scar traced a path from his left temple to a jawline that remained perpetually locked as if bracing for a ghost impact. His eyes, the color of a cold Atlantic storm, scanned the town's straight streets not for beauty, but for structural integrity and hidden threats. He moved with a haunting, deliberate grace, his heavy boots striking the frozen earth with the finality of a shell casing hitting the sand. He was a man who had traded his rifle for a set of calloused hands, a laborer who lived in a different time zone where the dust never quite settled and the sun never quite rose. Cooper sat at his heel, his chocolate Labrador coat so heavily dusted with gray around the muzzle that it looked like he had been breathing frost. He was a retired mine detection dog, a veteran whose amber eyes still scanned the shadows with a professional, terrifying intensity that mirrored his master's. A notched ear and a rhythmic heavy limp in his rear right leg were the only physical debts he owed to a blast that had almost claimed them both years ago. He was Jack's external soul, a creature that could read the rising static of PTSD in Jack's pulse before a single muscle in the man's scarred face ever twitched. Cooper didn't seek the affection of strangers or the comfort of a warm hearth. He was a silent guardian, a four-legged anchor keeping Jack moored to a world that felt increasingly alien. Together, they moved through the slush of the main street, a pair of broken soldiers walking in perfect haunted synchronization. As they moved through the center of town, the atmosphere felt as brittle as the ice forming on the puddles. Sarah Gable watched them through the frost-streaked window of the land registry office, her thin lips pursed in an instinctive, sharp disapproval. At 68, Sarah was a woman carved from dried cedar, tall, angular, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bob that looked like a crown of steel wool. Her skin was a translucent parchment of fine wrinkles, stretched over cheekbones as sharp as a flint blade, and she wore a high-collared wool sweater that made her look like a Victorian sentinel. Her personality was a prickly blend of extreme efficiency and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who didn't fit the valley's square-built mold. To her, Jack was a jagged edge, a man who looked like he carried enough internal explosives to disrupt the quiet she spent her life guarding. Sarah marked Jack's arrival with a nervous rhythm of her fingers on the counter, noting his tattered gear and the limping dog with a frown that spoke of moral judgment. Clearcut was a town of straight lines, white fences, and predictable lives, and Jack's scarred presence was a disruption she intended to monitor with the vigilance of a hawk. She represented the town's silent wall of exclusion, a gatekeeper who saw the war in his eyes and decided it was a contagion that didn't belong in her valley. To her, a man without a home or a clear purpose was a man who brought trouble, and she made a mental note to mention the stranger to the sheriff before the sun fully set. She watched him until he was nothing more than a dark silhouette against the white-out conditions of the rising storm, her heart as cold as the glass she peered through. Jack eventually stood before Elias Thorne at the local lumber mill, seeking the only thing he had left to offer the world, his brute labor. Elias was a mountain of a man in his mid-50s, with shoulders so wide he seemed to fill the entire office doorway with his looming, tree-like presence. His skin was the color of dark mahogany, cured by decades of sawdust and Wyoming sun, and his hands were gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak. He was missing the tip of his ring finger, a sacrifice to the saws years ago, and his beard was a chaotic thicket of iron-gray hair that smelled of pine resin and tobacco. Elias was a man who spoke in grunts and evaluated men by the depth of the calluses on their palms, having little patience for the soft, the loud, or the weak-willed. Elias looked at Jack's scars, then at the dog's limp, and felt a flicker of grim, silent recognition that required no words of sympathy. He had seen the 1,000-yard stare before in the eyes of his own father. He knew that for men like Jack, the scream of the circular saws was often the only noise loud enough to drown out the echoes of the desert. He didn't ask for a resume, inquire about Jack's past, or even offer a handshake. He simply handed Jack a pair of heavy leather gloves and pointed toward a stack of frozen, waterlogged pine beams. Jack nodded, the familiar weight of a mission settling over him as he hoisted the first beam onto his shoulder. His internal clock shifted back into the disciplined rhythm of an objective identified and a task accepted, finding a strange comfort in the simple, honest brutality of the work. The work at the mill was a grueling, soul-crushing grind that Jack welcomed with a desperate, feverish hunger every single morning. Every time he hoisted a water-heavy beam onto his aching shoulder, the physical pain acted as a barrier, a wall of fire that kept the phantom shadows of mortar fire at bay. He worked in the loudest, most dangerous part of the seasoning shed, where the massive blades shrieked through timber with a deafening, white noise intensity that others fled from. While the other laborers complained about the numbing cold and the splinters, Jack worked in a trance-like state, finding a rhythmic peace in the strain of his muscles and the sharp, clean scent of fresh sawdust. For Jack, exhaustion wasn't a burden to be avoided. It was a sanctuary where his mind could finally go quiet and the ghosts could no longer whisper. Among the younger workers was Hank, a lanky, red-faced youth in his early 20s who wore his cap backward and constantly chewed on a frayed plastic straw. Hank was the town's jester, a harmless but loudmouthed boy who tried to pester Jack with incessant questions about his scars and his silent, limping dog. He was the kind of person who had never seen a day of true hardship, his skin still soft and his smile too easy for a place as hard as Wyoming. Jack met every inquiry with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical wall, an impenetrable fortress of privacy that Hank eventually learned not to breach out of a growing, instinctive fear. Jack wasn't being rude, he was simply occupied with the weight of the wood and the ghost static in his head, living in a world Hank couldn't possibly understand. By the end of a month of grueling labor, Jack had scraped together enough from his meager outsider's wage to buy a plot of land Sarah Gable had called the Devil's Hearth. It was a barren, rocky acre on the high ridge where the soil was too thin for trees, and the wind blew so hard it had polished the stones smooth as glass. Jack didn't want fertile soil, a garden, or a view of the town. He wanted the high ground, a place with clear lines of sight where he could see a threat coming from miles away. The ridge was a reflection of his own soul, rugged, exposed, and abandoned by those who preferred the comfort of the valley below. It was the only place in Clearcut where he felt the air was thin enough to breathe without the suffocating weight of the town's silent judgment. Sarah Gable sneered as she handed over the deed at the registry office, her ash-blonde bob quivering with a mix of triumph and pity. She was convinced the broken soldier would be frozen solid by mid-January. His strange dog, a casualty of his madness, and his inability to live among civilized folk. Jack merely tucked the paper into his canvas jacket, his flinty eyes showing no emotion as he whistled for Cooper, who was waiting by the door. He didn't tell her that he needed the wind to scream louder than his memories, or that he preferred the company of the cold ridge over the suffocating squareness of her town. He walked away without a word, Cooper's rhythmic limp tapping a steady metallic beat on the wooden floorboards behind him as they headed toward their new, lonely home. They moved onto the ridge as the first true blizzard began to veil the mountains in a blinding white shroud that erased the world. Jack didn't have the funds for a cabin yet, so he pitched a heavy military-grade canvas tent in the center of the rocky clearing. The interior was a cramped, Spartan world of olive drab, smelling of wet fur and kerosene, a temporary fortress against the Wyoming frost. Jack spent his first evening bracing the tent poles with heavy boulders, his joints throbbing with the fire of a dozen old injuries sustained in distant lands. The ridge was a lonely, exposed world, far above the judgmental lights of Clearcut, a place where the only law was survival and the only witness was the moon. Inside the tent, the small wood stove Jack had salvaged from a scrap heap struggled to keep the frost from creeping across the floor like a living thing. Jack sat on a wooden crate, his hands trembling slightly as the silence of the forest began to press against the canvas walls like a heavy weight. It was in these quiet moments, when the wind died down, that the desert heat and the smell of cordite tried to slip back into his mind. His PTSD wasn't a memory. It was a physical presence, a tension in his spine that made every snap of a frozen branch outside sound like a sniper's shot. He sat in the flickering amber light of the stove, a man waiting for a war that was supposed to be over, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Cooper sensed the darkness rising in Jack before a single word or a single sigh was ever spoken. The dog limped over from his corner, pressing his warm, heavy flank against Jack's leg and resting his graying muzzle on Jack's knee. His amber eyes were locked onto his master's face with an intensity that demanded Jack return to the present, to the safety of the tent. Jack let out a long, shaky breath, his scarred fingers sinking into Cooper's thick, warm fur, grounding himself in the reality of the cold Wyoming night. He opened a single small tin of saltless beef, his own stomach growling with the hollow, persistent ache of hunger after 10 hours of labor at the mill. He watched with a faint, tired smile as the dog ate, finding a strange, quiet peace in the act of sacrifice and the simple joy of his companion. As the wind howled through the pines outside, Jack huddled under a moth-eaten wool blanket, pulling Cooper's warm, heavy body against his side for heat. In that Spartan tent, surrounded by the vast, indifferent cold of the Wyoming ridge, the veteran and his dog found the only sanctuary they had left. They were two broken soldiers, cast aside by a world of square houses and straight lines, warming each other in the only circle they could call home. They had survived the battlefield, and now they would survive the silence of the mountains together, one heartbeat at a time. The radio in Elias Thorne's office crackled with the frantic, static, heavy voice of a meteorologist from Cheyenne, warning of a polar vortex descending from the Arctic Circle like a frozen scythe. In the lumber mill, the air felt thick with a new kind of dread, a cold that didn't just bite the skin, but seemed to settle deep within the marrow. While the other workers gathered around the heater, whispering about stocking up on canned beans and firewood, Jack Miller stood by the massive circular saw, his eyes fixed on the blueprints he had scratched into the back of a plywood sheet. He didn't see a storm, he saw a structural challenge. His mind drifted back to a scorching valley in the Middle East, where he had watched a square, reinforced concrete bunker crumble under the sheer pressure of a localized sand cyclone because the wind had caught the 90-degree angles like a sail. He remembered the screams muffled by falling stone, a memory that triggered a sharp, phantom pain in his scarred temple. To Jack, a corner wasn't just a design choice, it was a structural liability, a place where the wind and the weight of the world found a foothold to tear everything down. On the high, exposed ridge of Devil's Hearth, he knew a traditional house would be nothing more than a pile of splinters within a week of the vortex's arrival, and he refused to let Cooper sleep in a death trap. He spent his extra hours at the mill taking on the heaviest shifts, hoarding every scrap of discarded rebar and damaged cement bags, his body becoming a lean, skeletal machine fueled by coffee and a singular, desperate purpose. The construction began in the gray pre-dawn light of early December, a time when the ground was so hard it rang like iron under Jack's pickaxe. He didn't start with walls, he started with a radius, driving a steel stake into the center of his rocky acre and using a long, high-tensile wire to carve a perfect circle into the permafrost. Every movement was a feat of engineering precision, his scarred hands steady despite the sub-zero temperatures, as he began to bend the rebar into precise, overlapping arcs. He had spent his last paycheck on industrial-grade steel and bags of rapid-set concrete, items that Sarah Gable had processed with a sneer of utter confusion at the registry office. To the people of Clearcut, a house was supposed to have 4 walls, a peaked roof, and a front porch. But Jack was building something that looked like an overturned cauldron. He spent his nights under the hum of a portable generator, welding the steel ribs into a skeletal dome that rose from the ridge like a strange metallic rib cage. He ignored the burning of his muscles and the frostbite nipping at his ears, his focus entirely on the physics of the curve, a shape with no dead angles, designed to let the howling Wyoming winds slip harmlessly over its surface rather than slamming into it. As the dome took shape, a new figure began to appear at the edge of the ridge, a man the locals called Thomas Old Tom Halloway. Thomas was a 72-year-old retired park ranger who had spent 40 winters in the Bitterroot Range, and his appearance was as rugged as the mountains themselves. He was a man of medium height, but possessed a barrel-like chest and a gait that suggested he had walked 1,000 miles of uphill terrain. His skin was the color of weathered saddle leather, deeply etched with lines from a lifetime of squinting at the sun and the snow, and his beard was a long, unkempt thicket of pure white that smelled faintly of pine resin and cherrywood pipe tobacco. Thomas wore a faded forest green parka with a fur-lined hood and carried a brass-bound barometer in his pocket like a holy relic. Unlike the rest of the town, Thomas didn't laugh. He watched Jack's progress with a quiet, observant intensity. His one good eye, the other was clouded by a milky cataract, tracking the way Jack reinforced the base of the dome with local river stones and heavy concrete. Thomas was a man who understood the cruelty of the mountains, a soul who had seen the wind lift a fully loaded truck off the ground, and in Jack's bizarre bowl, he saw a logic that terrified him because it meant the stranger knew something the town was too proud to admit. The mockery from the valley below, however, only grew louder as the first batches of concrete were poured. Leading the chorus of ridicule was Marcus Vane, the town's premier building contractor, and a man who took Jack's architectural choices as a personal insult. Marcus was 42, tall, and possessed a polished, athletic build that he maintained with the same vanity he applied to his fleet of shiny black pickup trucks. He was clean-shaven, with a jawline so sharp it looked manufactured, and he had a habit of wearing expensive leather work gloves that never seemed to get dirty. Marcus was an arrogant man, fueled by the success of building nearly every square home in Clearcut, and his personality was a toxic blend of corporate ambition and small-town elitism. He drove up to the ridge one afternoon, leaning out of his truck window to shout that Jack was building a concrete tomb for a dog. Marcus believed in the permanence of the homes he built, homes with steep roofs and wide eaves, and to him, Jack's dome was the work of a madman who had lost his mind in the desert. Jack didn't even look up from his trowel, but Cooper stood at the edge of the foundation, his low, vibrating growl acting as a far more effective deterrent than any verbal retort. Cooper's role in the construction was as vital as any tool in Jack's belt, his instincts sharpened by years of detecting buried explosives in shifting sands. As Jack poured the concrete into the curved forms, the old dog would pace the perimeter of the foundation, his muzzle low to the frozen earth. Cooper possessed an uncanny ability to sense the micro-vibrations of the shifting permafrost beneath the ridge. Whenever the ground settled unevenly, or a hidden air pocket in the rocky soil threatened the stability of the pour, Cooper would stop dead and emit a sharp, urgent bark, his amber eyes fixed on the problematic spot. Jack trusted the dog's senses more than any spirit level. He would immediately stop, reinforce the section with extra steel, and wait for Cooper's posture to relax before continuing. It was a silent, symbiotic dance of survival, a veteran and his mind dog ensuring their last fortress was built on a foundation that could withstand a tectonic shift. The townspeople, watching through binoculars from the warmth of their porches, laughed at the sight of a man taking orders from a limping dog. But on that ridge, the bond between the two was the only thing preventing a structural catastrophe. By mid-December, the dome was a thick gray shell of reinforced concrete, looking utterly alien against the white Wyoming landscape. Jack had begun the process of insulating the interior with layers of reflective foil and spray foam, a technique he had seen used in temporary command centers. The physical toll was immense. Jack had lost weight, his cheekbones now sharp enough to cut, and the silver scar on his temple seemed to throb with every beat of his overworked heart. He was starving himself, often surviving on little more than black coffee and the hard crusts of bread left over from Cooper's meals, his bank account drained to the last cent for the sake of the house. Sarah Gable had even visited the site under the guise of official inspection, her ash-blonde hair whipped into a frenzy by the wind as she walked around the windowless structure with an expression of pure disdain. She told Jack it looked like a monstrosity that devalued the neighboring wilderness, her Victorian sensibilities offended by the lack of a proper chimney or a wooden doorframe. Jack merely handed her the approved permits and went back to welding the steel-reinforced hatch that would serve as the entrance, his silence a shield against her pettiness. As the final batches of concrete set, A deathly hush fell over the valley, the kind of silence that precedes a great execution. The barometer in old Tom Halloway's pocket began to plummet, and the sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of violet that made the hair on the back of Jack's neck stand up. He stood atop his ridge, his hand resting on the smooth, cold curve of the dome, looking down at the town of Clearcut, with its beautiful, fragile square houses and their pointed roofs that were designed to catch the snow, not survive the wind. He knew that when the polar vortex struck, those roofs would become hammers, and those wide eaves would become levers that the wind would use to pry the homes from their foundations. Jack didn't feel superior. He felt a cold, leaden weight in his chest for the people who didn't understand that the world was about to change. He whistled for Cooper, and the two of them retreated into the dark, circular belly of the dome, sealing the heavy steel hatch behind them as the first scream of the Arctic wind hit the ridge, sliding harmlessly over the concrete sphere like water over a stone. The rhythmic scream of the lumber mill's twin-blade saws had become the heartbeat of Jack Miller's existence, a deafening roar that filled the hollow spaces of his weary mind. Every morning, before the bruised purple light of the Wyoming dawn could even touch the valley floor, Jack was already at his station, his breath pluming like dragon smoke in the sub-zero air. To afford the specialized high-grade marine cement and the heavy-duty industrial steel anchors required to bolt his dome to the living rock of the ridge, Jack had transformed himself into a ghost of pure labor. He took every overtime shift Elias Thorne offered, often working 12 hours straight until his vision blurred and his broad shoulders felt as though they were being pierced by heated needles. His diet had dwindled to the barest essentials of survival, hard, dry crusts of rye bread that tasted of sawdust and lukewarm coffee that had long since lost its flavor. While the other workers retreated to the warmth of the Timber Hole Tavern for hot stew and ale, Jack would sit alone in the corner of the drying shed, chewing his meager rations with a slow, mechanical determination. He wasn't just starving himself. He was investing every calorie and every cent into the concrete shell on the hill, treating the project with the desperate, meticulous intensity of a soldier fortifying a final fallback position. His hands were the most visible casualty of this relentless campaign. The combination of caustic cement dust, the freezing mountain air, and the abrasive friction of heavy timber had turned Jack's palms into a roadmap of pain. Deep, jagged cracks split the skin across his knuckles, weeping beads of crimson that froze almost instantly in the wind. He would wrap them in cheap electrical tape and tattered rags, refusing to spend a single dollar on medicinal salves that could instead go toward another box of recessed steel bolts. It was during these grueling weeks that a new presence emerged in the mill's daily routine. Clara Thorne, Elias's younger sister, and the mill's primary bookkeeper. Clara was 38, a woman with hair the color of rusted iron that she kept tucked tightly beneath a wool beanie, and eyes as sharp and gray as a winter river. Her skin was pale and dusted with a perpetual layer of fine sawdust, and she walked with a brisk, no-nonsense stride that commanded immediate silence from the rowdier laborers. Clara was a woman of profound observation and very few wasted breaths. She had spent her life managing the chaotic finances of the mill and the tempers of hard men. She watched Jack from her small, elevated office window, her gaze lingering on his bloody, taped hands and the way he carefully set aside the best cuts of discarded scrap wood. Unlike the others, Clara didn't see a madman. She saw a man who was preparing for a reckoning that no one else had the courage to name. One afternoon, she stepped down into the dust-choked shed and placed a small tin of industrial-grade lanolin on Jack's workbench without a word. Her only acknowledgement, a brief, solemn nod that recognized the silent war he was fighting. The work on the ridge, however, was where Jack's true battle took place. Every evening, after the mill had gone quiet and the town of Clearcut had retreated behind its white fences, Jack would return to Devil's Hearth to face the wind. He had reached the stage of surface refinement, a process that the townspeople found particularly hilarious. Using a handheld stone grinder and a series of increasingly fine abrasive pads, Jack began to polish the exterior of the concrete dome. He was applying a survival technique he had mastered as a combat engineer, the reduction of aerodynamic drag. He knew that even a small ridge or a rough patch on the concrete could give the screaming Arctic winds a fingerhold, a point of turbulence that could escalate into a structural failure. He spent hours under the flickering light of a battery-powered flood lamp. the grinder throwing off clouds of gray dust that turned his canvas jacket into a suit of stone. He smoothed the surface until the dome felt as slick and cold as an eggshell, ensuring that the wind would find no purchase, only a frictionless curve to slide over. This wasn't vanity, it was military-grade paranoia. Jack understood that in a valley known for its lethal wind tunnels, the slightest imperfection was a crack in the armor that death would eventually exploit. Cooper remained his silent, four-legged foreman, his role evolving from companion to quality controller. The old dog seemed to understand the gravity of the work, his chocolate coat now permanently matted with concrete dust. As Jack worked on the critical seams where the dome met the reinforced stone foundation, Cooper would pace the interior and exterior of the structure with a strange, focused anxiety. Occasionally, the dog would stop at a specific junction, a place where Jack had welded the steel rebar or tightened a foundation bolt, and begin to claw frantically at the surface, his low, urgent whines cutting through the howl of the wind. In the beginning, Jack thought it was just the dog's age or the cold, but his engineer's instinct forced him to investigate. Every single time Cooper flagged a spot, Jack found a flaw, a hairline fracture in the drying cement, a bolt that had vibrated loose in the permafrost, or a hidden air pocket that compromised the seal. Jack would sigh, his body screaming for rest, and he would grind the section out and redo it with agonizing precision until Cooper finally sat back on his haunches, his amber eyes calm. They were a two-man unit, a veteran and his mind dog, building a fortress with the same absolute intolerance for error they had once used to clear a path through a desert minefield. The isolation of the ridge was absolute, punctuated only by the distant, mocking laughter of the townspeople. Silas Vane, Marcus Vane's younger cousin and a delivery driver for the local hardware store, became the primary messenger of the town's disdain. Silas was 26, with a soft, doughy face and a sneer that he had inherited from his cousin. He lacked Marcus's athletic build, but shared his family's arrogant conviction in the superiority of proper, clear-cut homes. Silas would drive his delivery truck to the base of the ridge, refusing to go any further, and dump Jack's bags of cement into the snow with a loud, theatrical groan. He would mock Jack's gaunt appearance, calling him a scarecrow building a birdhouse, and laugh at the sight of Jack dragging the heavy bags up the slope on a makeshift sled. Silas represented the petty cruelty of a community that found comfort in the misfortune of outsiders, a man who believed that because Jack was starving, he must be wrong. Jack never replied. He simply waited for Silas to leave before beginning the long, painful trek up the ridge, his heart hardening with every insult, his focus narrowing until the only thing that mattered was the structural integrity of the curve. As the third week of December approached, the physical toll on Jack reached its zenith. He had lost nearly 20 pounds, his cheekbones protruding like knives beneath his weathered skin, and his silver scar seemed to pulse with a dark, angry life of its own. One night, while working on the internal ventilation shaft, a complex series of baffled pipes designed to allow air in while keeping the pressure waves of a storm out, Jack's legs finally gave way. He collapsed against the cold concrete wall, the world spinning into a gray abyss of exhaustion and hunger. He lay there for a long time, the dry rye bread in his pocket feeling like a lead weight, his tape-wrapped hands shaking uncontrollably. He felt the darkness of the old war trying to pull him under, the voices of his fallen comrades whispering that it was okay to let go, that the storm would be a peaceful end. It was Cooper who pulled him back. The dog wedged his large, warm head under Jack's arm, nudging him with a persistence that bordered on aggression. Cooper began to lick the salt and dust from Jack's face, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor, a sound that mimicked the steady beat of a drum. The dog then dragged Jack's heavy wool blanket across the floor, dropped it on his master's chest, and sat firmly on his legs to provide heat. Jack looked into those deep amber eyes and saw the same unshakable loyalty that had kept them alive when the world was made of fire and sand. He realized that the dome wasn't just a house, it was a promise. It was the only thing he could give the one creature who had never judged his scars or his silence. With a groan of pure agony, Jack forced himself upright, took a small bite of the dry bread, and picked up his wrench. He would not break. He would refine every seam and polish every inch until their sanctuary was perfect. Outside, the violet sky deepened into a terrifying, starless black, and the first true gale of the polar vortex began to scream against the smooth, polished concrete of the ridge, unable to find a single edge to tear away. The dawn of late December brought with it a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the suffocating weight of the approaching vortex. On the ridge of Devil's Hearth, the polished concrete dome stood as a defiant, silver-gray sphere against the jagged backdrop of the Bitterroot Range, looking less like a home and more like a celestial object that had plummeted from the heavens and taken root in the Wyoming rock. To the people of Clearcut, however, the house was no miracle. It was an eyesore, a psychological irritant that challenged the very foundation of their timber-built identity. As the structure reached completion, the town's passive-aggressive whispers curdled into an active, venomous hostility. Groups of men, led by the prideful Marcus Vane, would gather at the base of the ridge in their idling trucks, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow like accusing eyes. They viewed Jack Miller's dome as a monument to madness, a concrete cyst that polluted the pristine traditionalism of their valley. Jack remained an island of silence in this sea of resentment, refusing to engage with the insults shouted into the wind or the graffiti sprayed onto the boulders at the edge of his land. He spent his nights under the flicker of a single headlamp, his hands, still wrapped in Clara Thorne's lanolin and tattered rags, moving with a surgical precision as he began the final, most critical phase of the fortress, the air. The installation of the ventilation system was a masterpiece of combat engineering, a series of baffled steel-lined shafts that spiraled deep into the concrete shell before rising to the apex of the dome. Jack knew that, in a polar vortex, the greatest danger wasn't just the cold, but the pressure. He had seen traditional houses explode from the inside out because the wind had created a vacuum on the leeward side, or suffocate their occupants when snow blocked the chimneys. His system was designed with anti-cyclonic vents, tilted at 45-degree angles to allow oxygen to flow, while catching and draining any driven snow before it could enter the living space. While he worked on the internal baffles, a new figure of authority arrived on the ridge to deliver the town's final warning: Sheriff Roy Wade. Roy was a man of the valley, 56 years of age, with a frame that was slowly softening like a thawing riverbank, but still held the intimidating mass of his former days as a high school linebacker. His face was wide and perpetually flushed from the Wyoming cold, anchored by a thick horseshoe mustache that was more salt than pepper, and eyes that were a tired, faded green, the color of moss under ice. Roy was a man caught between his duty to the law and his loyalty to the people who voted for him, a man whose soul was frayed by the constant friction of small-town politics. He stepped out of his patrol car, his leather holster creaking in the frost, and looked at the dome with a mixture of pity and genuine concern. Unlike Marcus, Roy didn't want to humiliate Jack. He wanted him gone before the town did something they couldn't take back. He warned Jack that the Traditional Clearcut Association was filing an injunction to have the structure condemned as a public hazard, his voice heavy with the fatigue of a man who knew he was being used as a pawn by the Vane family. Leading the ideological charge behind the sheriff was Martha Vane, Marcus's older sister, a woman whose presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature. 44 years old and possessing a frame that was as thin and brittle as a frozen twig, she moved with a jerky, nervous energy that suggested a mind constantly looking for flaws in the world around her. Her hair was a stark, dyed raven black, pulled into a ponytail so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead into a permanent mask of tension. Her skin was unnervingly pale, and her lips were a thin, crimson line that rarely curved into anything resembling a smile. Martha was the ideological engine of the Vane family, a woman who believed that tradition was the only thing standing between Clearcut and the chaos of the outside world. She stood at the edge of the property line, her sharp voice cutting through the wind as she lectured a small crowd about the moral decay represented by a windowless, circular tomb. She viewed Jack's refusal to build a square home with a porch and a chimney as an act of treason against the community, a personal insult to the generations of timbermen who had settled the valley. Martha's hatred was a cold, calculated thing, fueled by a secret fear that the stranger on the hill saw a truth that she was terrified to acknowledge, that the world they had built was fragile. Jack ignored Martha's tirades. His focus narrowed on the hatch, a 300-pound steel door salvaged from a decommissioned blast shelter. He spent 48 hours straight welding the heavy-duty hinges into the reinforced concrete frame, the blue light of the arc welder casting long, demonic shadows against the ridge. The door wasn't just designed to close, it was designed to seal, equipped with an industrial-grade rubber gasket and a triple-locking cam system that would make the interior airtight. As he worked, Cooper took up a position that chilled the blood of the townspeople watching through their scopes. The old dog would climb to a small, flat perch Jack had built near the apex of the dome, sitting perfectly still as a sentry. From that high vantage point, Cooper's amber eyes scanned the valley with a predatory focus, his ears twitching at the sound of every idling engine or whispered threat. He was no longer a limping pet. He was a gargoyle made of fur and instinct, a living radar system that alerted Jack to the sheriff's approach long before the patrol car reached the ridge. The sight of the mine dog standing atop the concrete sphere, silhouetted against the violet Wyoming sky, reinforced the town's belief that they were dealing with a pair of dangerous, unpredictable outcasts. The isolation of the ridge became a tangible thing, a wall of silence that Jack used to his advantage. Inside the dome, the atmosphere was stark and utilitarian. He had built a series of recessed bunks into the curved walls, far more than were necessary for a single man and a dog. He had installed a heavy-duty multi-fuel stove in the center, with the ventilation pipes radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Most importantly, Jack had excavated a hidden subfloor beneath the main living area, a space he filled with crates of dry rations, medical supplies, and hundreds of gallons of bottled water. The town thought he was building a tomb, but Jack was building a life raft. His plan, conceived in the quiet hours of his military service, was born from a haunting sense of altruism that he refused to voice. He knew that when the polar vortex struck, the square world below would crumble. He knew that the white fences and the steep-pitched roofs of Martha Vane's beloved tradition would become shrapnel. Quietly, and with a stubborn, silent persistence, Jack was preparing for the moment when the people who hated him would have nowhere else to go. He wasn't building the dome just to survive. He was building it to be the only thing left standing when the valley finally broke. As the final lock clicked into place on the steel hatch, the wind shifted. The screaming gale of the last few days suddenly died down, replaced by an eerie, absolute silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of minutes, the air becoming so cold that it felt like inhaling shards of glass. Jack stood at the open hatch, looking down at the lights of Clearcut one last time. He saw Marcus Vane's shiny truck driving through the streets. He saw Sarah Gable locking the registry office. And he saw the fragile, beautiful homes with their wide eaves and their wooden porches. He felt a pang of profound sorrow, a soldier's grief for a civilian population that refused to see the incoming fire. Cooper nudged his hand, his muzzle cold against Jack's palm, urging him inside. Jack stepped through the threshold and pulled the 300-pound steel door shut. The triple locking cam engaged with a heavy metallic thud that echoed through the circular chamber like a heartbeat. The fortress was sealed. Outside, the violet sky finally turned to a terrifying pitch-black void, and the first true wall of the polar vortex, a massive light-devouring front of ice and wind, rolled over the ridge of Devil's Hearth, ready to erase everything that wasn't built to last. The afternoon sun did not set so much as it was swallowed by a sky that had curdled into a terrifying, unnatural shade of bruised violet. It was a hue that Jack Miller had seen only once before, right before a desert sandstorm had turned midday into a pitch-black tomb. But here in the Wyoming high country, the color felt colder, more malevolent, as if the very air were being strangled. Jack stood on the polished concrete apron of his dome, his breath hitching in his chest, not from the cold, but from the sudden, violent drop in atmospheric pressure that made his ears pop, and his old war wounds throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. He held his M19 military-grade barometer, a heavy brass-cased relic from his engineering days, and watched with a grim, narrowing gaze as the needle began to spin counterclockwise with a frantic, stuttering urgency. The air had gone deathly still, the kind of silence that precedes a great execution. And yet, the atmosphere felt heavy, vibrating with an infrasound that Jack could feel in his marrow. This was the birth of the monster he had been building against, a supercell vortex, a rare and lethal convergence of Arctic air and mountain-trapped pressure that would turn the valley of Clearcut into a blender of ice and timber. He looked down toward the town, where the amber lights of the traditional wooden houses were flickering on in a deceptive display of normalcy, and he felt a cold, leaden weight of pity for the people who believed their white fences and steep-pitched roofs could protect them from the vacuum that was about to scream through their lives. Cooper began to howl then, a sound that was less like a dog's bark and more like a primal, ancient lament that echoed off the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. The old Labrador mix was standing at the very edge of the ridge, his silvered muzzle pointed toward the southwestern horizon, where the clouds were beginning to rotate in a slow, churning dance of death. Cooper's chocolate fur was standing in stiff, electrified ridges along his spine, and his amber eyes were wide, reflecting the purple gloom of the sky with a terrifying, predatory intensity. He wasn't just barking at the wind. He was warning the earth itself. As the first low-frequency tremor shivered through the rocky soil of Devil's Hearth, Cooper's howling reached a frantic, jagged pitch that signaled the arrival of the dead zone. Jack didn't need to see the storm to know it was there. He trusted the dog's sixth sense more than any radar. Just as he turned to usher Cooper inside, a movement at the base of his ridge caught his flinty eyes. It was a solitary figure, struggling against the rising static of the air, a young boy no older than 14, named Caleb Vance. Caleb was a distant relation to Marcus Vane, but he possessed none of the builder's arrogance. He was a lanky, quiet youth, with a mop of unruly, coal-black hair that constantly fell into his large, observant eyes. He wore an oversized, tattered hunting jacket that smelled of old cedar and wood smoke, and his skin was pale, dusted with a light spray of freckles across a nose that had been broken in a childhood fall. Caleb was the town's silent observer, a boy who spent more time in the woods than in a classroom, and he had been watching Jack's construction from the shadows for weeks, with an unspoken, wide-eyed admiration for the veteran's grit. Jack shouted for the boy to get back to the valley, his voice a gravelly roar that was almost swallowed by the sudden, rising whistle of the wind. But Caleb simply pointed toward the sky, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The first pressure wave hit then, a wall of air that felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath from Jack's lungs. He realized in that instant that the boy would never make it back to the town before the vortex closed the mountain passes. Without a word, Jack lunged forward, grabbing Caleb by the scruff of his heavy jacket and dragging him toward the open steel hatch of the dome, with Cooper nipping at their heels in a frantic effort to move them toward safety. They scrambled inside the circular belly of the fortress, and Jack threw his entire weight against the 300-pound steel door. The triple-locking cam system engaged with a heavy, metallic thud that signaled the end of their contact with the outside world. Jack spun the heavy iron wheel, feeling the rubber gaskets compress and seal the chamber airtight, just as the first true scream of the polar vortex slammed into the ridge. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like 1,000 freight trains derailing simultaneously against the concrete shell of the house. Inside, the atmosphere was stark and focused. Jack immediately moved to his supply crates, his scarred hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic. He ignored the shivering boy huddled against the curved wall and began to lay out his red zone kit. Trauma bandages, portable oxygen canisters, and high-calorie emergency rations. He checked the pressure gauges near the ventilation baffles, his eyes scanning the numbers with a cold, analytical precision. The external pressure was dropping so fast, it was threatening to create a suction effect that could collapse a human lung if the intake valves failed. Jack reached up and manually adjusted the steel baffles, closing the primary vents and switching the dome to its internal, recycled air system. A closed-loop circuit he had designed for exactly this moment of atmospheric crisis. He was a man in his element, the chaos of the storm providing a strange, sharpening focus to his mind that the peace of the valley never could. He moved with a restless, calculated energy, his oil-stained canvas jacket rustling as he checked the tension on the foundation bolts, ensuring that the dome remained anchored to the living rock as the ground beneath them began to vibrate with the tectonic fury of the storm. Caleb Vance watched the veteran with a mixture of fear and awe, his small hands clutching the moth-eaten wool blanket Jack had tossed his way. The boy noticed the way Jack's silver scar seemed to pulse with a dark, angry life of its own in the flickering amber light of the multi-fuel stove. Caleb had heard the stories in town, that Jack was a broken toy, a madman who had lost his soul in the desert sands. Nhung, Nhin, Ngoi, Jan, Ong, Nai Thao Tak, Voin Hung, Ko Me Bang Thep Va Be Tong, Kao Be Chi Thai Mot, Ngoi Lin Jang Bao Ve Phao Jai Quoi Kung Qua Ming. Caleb's presence added a new weight to Jack's burden, a civilian life that he was now responsible for. But the veteran didn't complain. He merely pointed to a recessed bunk and told the boy to stay down and keep his mouth shut. Jack then turned his attention back to Cooper. The dog had taken up a position directly in front of the seal's steel hatch, his body tense and his ears swept back against his skull. Cooper wasn't just resting, he was listening to the earth. His paws were spread wide on the floorboards, feeling the micro-tremors of the ridge as the vortex began to peel the very surface of the mountain away. Every few seconds, the dog would emit a low, vibrating growl that vibrated through the floor and into Jack's boots, a specialized warning that the scream was approaching its peak. The first true impact hit the dome 10 minutes later, a massive multi-ton object, likely an uprooted ancient pine or a piece of a neighboring structure, accelerated to 100 miles an hour by the wind. The sound was deafening, a catastrophic boom that would have shattered a square house into splinters and sent the roof flying into the abyss. But against the polished aerodynamic curve of the dome, the object simply glanced off. The force of the impact was dissipated by the geometry of the sphere, the energy rolling over the concrete surface and into the mountain, rather than through the walls. The dome groaned, the internal steel ribs singing with a high-pitched metallic tension, but it held. Jack stood in the center of the room, his hand resting on the warm side of the stove, his amber eyes locked with Cooper's. They were no longer in Wyoming. They were in a pocket of space and time that the storm could not reach. Outside, the violet sky had turned to a terrifying pitch-black void, and the town of Clearcut was being erased by a wall of ice and vacuum. Inside the bizarre house, the veteran, the boy, and the mine dog sat in a circle of fragile, artificial light, waiting for the ground to stop shaking. Cooper's ears remained upright, his focus absolute, as he listened to the heartbeat of the storm, ready to signal the moment when the silence would finally return. The world outside the concrete shell did not merely dissolve into a storm, it detonated. By midnight, the polar vortex had matured into a multi-vortex winter tornado, a rare atmospheric demon that combined the bone-shattering cold of the Arctic with the kinetic violence of a localized cyclone. The sound was no longer recognizable as wind. It had transformed into a continuous subterranean thrum, a devil's scream that vibrated through the very bedrock of the Bitterroot Range. Inside the dome, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and the faint metallic scent of ozone. Jack Miller sat on the floor, his back pressed against the curved wall, one hand gripping Cooper's heavy leather harness, while the other rested on the shoulder of Caleb Vance. The boy was shivering with such intensity that his teeth rattled like dry dice in a jar, his eyes wide and vacant, as he listened to the terrifying symphony of destruction occurring inches away. Jack felt the pressure drop in his sinuses, a sharp, stabbing pain that signaled the arrival of the storm's core. He watched the analog pressure gauges on his bulkhead. The needles were vibrating so violently they looked like blurred wings. Outside, the atmosphere was trying to tear itself apart, creating a massive suction effect that would have imploded a standard wooden frame house in seconds. But the dome remained an unyielding island of geometry, because there were no eaves to catch the wind, no flat walls to absorb the impact, and no 90-degree angles to create turbulence. The wind had no choice but to slide. The storm was being forced to move around the obstacle, its lethal energy glancing off the polished concrete surface like a blade off a shield. Jack could hear the debris, the shrapnel of the town below, hitting the shell. Splinters of oak, shards of glass, and entire sheets of corrugated metal slammed into the dome at 200 miles per hour, the sound like the rhythmic pounding of a giant's fist. Each strike sent a shudder through the floorboards, but the military-grade reinforced concrete, poured into a single seamless monolithic curve, didn't show a single crack. As the peak of the vortex rolled over the ridge, the long-range radio crackled to life with a sound that chilled Jack's blood more than the Arctic air. Through the static and the howling interference, a new voice emerged, distorted, desperate, and filled with a primal terror. It belonged to Miriam Thorne, the 52-year-old wife of Elias Thorne. Miriam was the moral anchor of the valley, a woman with skin the color of cream and honey, and eyes a deep, soulful hazel that had seen decades of Wyoming's joys and sorrows. She was known for her waist-length silver hair, which she usually wore in a thick, intricate braid, and a personality that was a rare blend of fierce matriarchal protection and quiet, poetic wisdom. Miriam had been the only one in town who had ever looked at Jack Miller with a smile that carried no judgment, a woman who understood that silence was often a form of prayer. Now, her voice was a jagged rasp over the airwaves. She was broadcasting from the cellar of the Thorne farmhouse, reporting that the main structure had been completely sheared away. She spoke of the black wind that had lifted their century-old barn into the sky as if it were made of paper. Jack listened, his jaw tightening until the scar on his temple turned a vivid, angry white. He heard the sound of timber groaning and the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of wind entering a breached space. Miriam wasn't asking for help. She knew no one could reach them. She was simply speaking into the void, a final testimony to the strength of the valley she loved. In the background, Jack could hear a child crying, likely Elias's granddaughter, and the rhythmic heavy thud of something massive hitting the cellar door. The square world of Elias Thorne, built on generations of timber tradition, was being systematically erased. The structural failure of the town was audible even through the thick concrete walls. Jack's trained engineer's ears could distinguish the different signatures of the destruction. There was the sharp crack-pop of seasoned pine studs snapping under the lateral load, followed by the whump of a roof being lifted off by the Bernoulli effect, the same principle that allowed a wing to fly, but in this case, it was turning homes into kites. Clearcut was being dismantled. The white fences Sarah Gable loved so much were now millions of lethal wooden needles flying through the dark. The steep-pitched roofs Martha Vane championed as sturdy were catching the wind like parachutes, prying the walls out from their foundations. Jack looked at Caleb, who had buried his face in Cooper's fur. The boy's family home was likely gone by now. Jack felt a surge of cold, focused anger, not at the people, but at the arrogance of the architecture that had failed them. He reached out and adjusted the manual override on the ventilation baffles again, his calloused fingers moving with a mechanical certainty. He was managing the internal air pressure of the dome, bleeding small amounts of air to match the external vacuum, a delicate balancing act that kept the concrete from experiencing a catastrophic tension load. It was a technique used in submarine warfare, and Jack was performing it with the calm of a man who had lived his entire life preparing for a disaster that no one else believed in. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar, a heavy metallic clack, clack, clack against the steel hatch. Cooper stood up instantly, his chocolate fur bristling, a low, dangerous growl vibrating in his chest. Jack froze, his hand going to the heavy iron wheel of the lock. No human could be outside in this. The temperature was likely 60 below zero, and the wind would have scoured the skin from a man's bones in minutes. Yet, the sound continued, rhythmic and persistent. Jack peered through the armored glass porthole, a thick circular lens designed to withstand a direct hit from a rifle. In the strobing violet light of the storm, he saw a shape huddled against the curve of the dome, anchored by a heavy climbing rope that disappeared into the whiteout. It was Officer Dave Briggs, a 28-year-old deputy who had served under Sheriff Wade. Dave was a former high school wrestling champion, a man with a thick bull neck and a face that was usually split by a wide, gap-toothed grin. He was a man of action, possessing a personality that was simple, loyal, and incredibly stubborn. Now Dave's face was a mask of frostbite and blood, his eyes nearly frozen shut. He had tied himself to the heavy steel reinforcements Jack had left exposed on the apron of the dome, a desperate last-ditch effort to find the only structure in the valley that hadn't moved. Dave was the first survivor to reach the ridge, a testament to the sheer physical will of a man who refused to die. Jack didn't hesitate. He knew the risks. Opening the hatch for even a second could cause a pressure spike that might rupture their eardrums, or allow the vacuum to pull Caleb out into the abyss. He barked an order for Caleb to move to the far side of the dome and anchor himself to the stove. Jack then grabbed a heavy safety tether, clipped it to his belt, and braced his boots against the floor. He signaled to Cooper to stay back. With a grunt of agonizing effort, Jack spun the iron wheel, the triple cams disengaging with a sound like a gunshot. The pressure difference was so great, that the 300-pound steel door screamed as it was sucked outward. Jack held onto the handle with every ounce of his combat-hardened strength, the Arctic air rushing in like a solid wall of dry ice. He reached out into the blackness, his gloved hand finding Dave's frozen jacket, and hauled the deputy inside with a roar of exertion. He slammed the door shut and spun the wheel back into the locked position, the seal engaging with a thud that felt like a final heartbeat. The interior of the dome was suddenly filled with a swirling cloud of snow and the smell of the frozen void. Dave Briggs collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking so violently that he couldn't speak. Jack immediately went to work, his movements a blur of clinical efficiency. He stripped the frozen gear from the deputy's body, wrapping him in the thermal blankets he had stockpiled in the subfloor. Caleb watched, frozen in shock, as the veteran he had once feared became a savior. The dome was no longer a crazy bowl or a tomb. It was a lifeboat in a drowning world. Jack looked up at the smooth, windowless ceiling of his sanctuary. The storm was still peaking, the vibration so intense that the water in their storage jugs was rippling in perfect concentric circles. He realized then that his silent, solitary labor had created more than just a house. He had built a bridge between life and death. The people of Clearcut had mocked the round house, but in the heart of the great winter tornado, the geometry of the circle was the only thing that remained unbroken. Jack looked at Cooper, the old dog now licking Dave's frozen face to provide warmth. They were 3 humans and a dog, huddled together in the only warm spot in a 100-mile radius. Outside, the Bitterroot Valley was being ground into dust by the polar vortex, but inside the circular fortress, the heart of the community had begun to beat again, shielded by a veteran's scars and the strength of a perfect curve. The interior of the dome, which had previously seemed like a cramped utilitarian cell to Caleb Vance and the half-frozen deputy Dave Briggs, suddenly underwent a transformation that defied the very laws of small-town perception. As the roar of the polar vortex outside reached a deafening, glass-shattering crescendo, Jack Miller did not retreat into a corner to pray for his own survival. Instead, he moved toward the center of the circular room, his scarred face illuminated by the harsh, clinical glare of a secondary emergency lighting system he had just activated. With a series of rhythmic, heavy clacks, Jack began to pull back the heavy plywood floorboards he had installed weeks ago. Caleb watched, his breath catching in his throat, as the true architecture of the bizarre house was revealed. Beneath the modest living space lay a massive, subterranean expansion, a circular descent that Jack had secretly excavated during those long, lonely nights when the town thought he was merely digging a hole for a tomb. The concrete bowl was merely the lid of a vast, reinforced silo. Downward spiraling tiers revealed dozens of recessed, thermal-padded bunks, each equipped with its own independent oxygen supply and a thick, wool-lined survival sleeping bag. The air down there was pre-warmed by the central multi-fuel stove, the heat radiating through a complex series of copper pipes embedded in the floor. This wasn't a home for a lonely veteran and his dog. It was a military-grade community fallout shelter, meticulously designed to house at least 50 people in total isolation for a month. The secret of Jack's starvation and his miserable wages finally clicked into place for Caleb. Jack hadn't been immune because he was poor. He had been diverting 90% of his income and his own caloric intake to stockpile thousands of cans of high-protein rations, crates of medical-grade antibiotics, and hundreds of wool blankets that were now visible in the neatly organized steel lockers lining the lower walls. Every overtime hour at the mill, every drop of blood from his cracked hands, and every insult he had swallowed from Sarah Gable and Marcus Vane had been a down payment on the lives of the very people who wanted him gone. Jack had been the only man in the valley who had looked at the weather data and the aging timber structures of Clearcut and reached the logical conclusion: the town was a graveyard waiting for a storm. He hadn't built a fortress to keep the world out. He had built a life raft to pull the world in. Cooper stood at the edge of the descent, his amber eyes reflecting the light of the subterranean ward, his tail giving a single, authoritative thump against the concrete. The dog knew. He had helped Jack measure these spaces, guarding the site while Jack worked through the nights to ensure that the circle of life was large enough to hold the weight of a broken community. Jack didn't give Caleb or Dave time to process the shock. He began to gear up with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. He donned a heavy military-grade exoskeleton harness designed to distribute the weight of a rescue pack and strapped a high-powered waterproof searchlight to his chest. He pulled on a pair of thermal goggles that gave him the appearance of a faceless metallic insect. Beside him, Cooper was also being prepared. Jack fitted the dog with a heated, high-visibility Kevlar vest, equipped with 2 heavy-duty panniers filled with emergency medical kits and thermal flasks of concentrated broth. The dog stood still, his muscles tensing in anticipation, his rhythmic limp momentarily forgotten as the mine detection instinct was replaced by the search and rescue fire. Jack turned to Dave Briggs, who was still shivering under a pile of blankets. Jack's voice was no longer a gravelly growl. It was the sharp, clear command of a sergeant. He told Dave that he was the only able-bodied officer left and that they had 15 minutes before the eye of the vortex passed over. They had to move now if they were to find the people trapped in the rubble of the valley below. Just as Jack prepared to unseal the hatch, a new figure stumbled into the faint light of the outer apron, visible through the porthole. It was Tobias "Toby" Vance, Caleb's father, and a man who had been one of the loudest voices mocking Jack's concrete bowl at the Timber Hole Tavern. Tobias was 45, a man of raw, muscular power, with a thick flame-red beard that was now a frozen mask of ice. His skin was the color of a winter sunset, flushed a dangerous purple from stage 2 hypothermia, and his left arm hung at a sickening, unnatural angle, clearly shattered by falling timber. Tobias was a man of the woods, a logger, who believed that muscle and a sharp axe were the only tools a man needed, a personality defined by a stubborn, old-world pride that had prevented him from ever asking for help. Now, he was a broken animal, his eyes wide with a delirious, pleading terror. He had crawled up the ridge on his knees, following the faint, bioluminescent trail Jack had secretly painted on the rocks weeks ago as a guide for survivors. Jack threw open the hatch, the Arctic wind rushing in with the force of a physical explosion. He hauled Tobias inside with a single, powerful jerk of his arm, tossing the massive man onto the floorboards like a discarded log. Caleb screamed, "Dad!" and rushed forward, but Jack held him back with a firm hand. He didn't waste time with a reunion. He pointed Caleb toward the medical crates in the subfloor and ordered him to begin the thaw protocol he had taught him during the construction weeks. Jack then looked at Cooper. The dog was already at the hatch, his nose twitching, catching the scent of more survivors trapped in the shifting whiteout of the valley. Tobias looked up at Jack, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely form words, his eyes taking in the vast, hidden sanctuary of the dome and the thousands of pounds of supplies Jack had sacrificed his own health to stockpile. The realization of his own cruelty and the silent, Christ-like endurance of the man he had called a drifter shattered Tobias's pride more effectively than the storm ever could. He reached out a trembling, frostbitten hand, but Jack didn't take it. Jack simply checked the battery on his searchlight, whistled for Cooper, and stepped out into the black, screaming abyss of the polar vortex. The trek down the ridge was a descent into a nightmare of ice and shrapnel. The wind was so strong that Jack and Cooper had to move in a linked harness, their bodies connected by a heavy climbing rope so the wind couldn't separate them. Jack used his knowledge of the ridge's topography, navigating by the dead zones he had mapped out during the dome's construction, places where the circular geometry of the rocks provided temporary shelter from the gale. He followed Cooper's lead, the dog's superior senses finding the scent of human fear and wet timber through the wall of whiteout. They found the first group of survivors huddled in the wreckage of Sarah Gable's registry office. The square building had been sliced in half by a flying piece of the mill's roof. Sarah was there, her ash-blonde hair a tangled mess of blood and ice, her Victorian sweater torn to rags as she tried to shield 2 terrified children. She looked up at the metallic, glowing figure of Jack Miller emerging from the storm and didn't see a jagged edge or a madman. She saw the only hand of God left in Wyoming. Jack didn't say a word. He handed her a thermal flask from Cooper's pack, tethered the group together, and began the long, agonizing crawl back up the ridge toward the bizarre house that was now the only lighthouse in a dead world. Behind him, the valley of Clearcut continued to groan and shatter, the tradition of square houses falling into the dark, while the circle on the hill waited to hold them all. The world beyond the steel hatch of the dome had dissolved into a vertical abyss of frozen static, a whiteout so absolute that the concept of direction had ceased to exist. Jack Miller stood at the epicenter of this crystalline chaos, a silhouette of high-tech nylon and reinforced steel tethered to the chocolate-furred engine of determination that was Cooper. The wind didn't just howl, it exerted a physical pressure that felt like being submerged in a river of liquid ice. Jack adjusted his thermal goggles, the digital overlay struggling to cut through the density of the driving snow, but he didn't rely on technology alone. He relied on the rope, and he relied on the dog. Cooper was in his element, his senses reverting to the hyper-focused mine detection mode that had once saved their lives in the scorched valleys of another continent. The dog moved with a low, predatory crouch, his graying muzzle skimming the surface of the 10-foot drifts. He wasn't just smelling for breath, he was mapping the subterranean voids created by the collapse of the square houses below. To Cooper, the ruins of Clearcut were merely a different kind of minefield, and the humans trapped beneath were the targets he had been trained to find with surgical precision. Their first stop was the skeletal remains of the Thorn lumber mill, a place where the wind had performed a gruesome surgery, peeling the corrugated roof away and snapping the massive support beams like dry kindling. Cooper stopped suddenly near the seasoning shed, his body tensing into a rigid directional point. He began to dig with a frantic rhythmic intensity, his paws throwing up clouds of frozen grit. Jack moved in, the hydraulic servos of his rescue harness hissing as he braced his boots against a jagged piece of the foundation. Beneath the splintered pine and the weight of a collapsed drying rack, he found a hand, blue, stiff, and clutching a broken saw blade. It belonged to Benner, Old Ben Grissom, a 64-year-old sawyer who had lived in the valley his entire life and was the primary architect of the Jack the Drifter rumors at the tavern. Benner was a man with a face like a dried-out riverbed, deeply etched with lines of cynicism and a life spent fighting the mountain for every paycheck. He had sunken, bitter eyes and was missing 3 fingers on his left hand from a mill accident 20 years ago, a loss that had turned his personality into a sharp, jagged thing, prone to lashing out at anyone he deemed unproven. Jack didn't hesitate to save the man who had once spat at his boots. He used a hydraulic spreader from his pack to lift a 2-ton timber beam, his muscles screaming under the combined load of the ice and the gravity. With a roar of exertion that was lost to the gale, Jack cleared the debris and hauled Benner out of the icy tomb. The old man looked up at the faceless, glowing figure of Jack Miller, his mind delirious with hypothermia, unable to reconcile the crazy soldier with the titan who had just lifted a house off his chest. Jack didn't offer words of comfort. He simply strapped Benner into a towed survival sled and signaled for Cooper to move on. There was no time for apologies or explanations. Every second they spent in the white night was a second the polar vortex used to suck the heat from their marrow. The trek continued toward the residential district, or what was left of it. Clearcut was now a graveyard of square geometry. Cooper led them to the site of the Vane Mansion, where the traditional architecture had become a death trap. The dog bypassed the main rubble and headed straight for the kitchen's substructure, his notch-eared head tilting as he caught a faint, rhythmic scratching sound. Beneath a mountain of decorative stonework and shattered oak, they found Sarah Gable and a new survivor, Eleanor Nell Vane, Marcus's 70-year-old mother. Nell was a woman of fading elegance, with silver hair that had once been her pride and skin as thin and translucent as a dragonfly's wing. She had spent her life as the valley's most respected gardener, a personality defined by a quiet, fragile grace and a deep love for things that grew slowly. Now she was huddled in a pocket of air, her legs pinned by a fallen piano, her hazel eyes clouded with a shock that transcended physical pain. Jack worked with the precision of an engineer, using a series of inflatable airbags to slowly lift the debris without triggering a secondary collapse. He ignored the freezing slush that filled his boots and the ice forming on his goggles, his focus absolute. When Nell was finally free, she gripped Jack's forearm with a strength that surprised him, her voice a thin, grateful whisper that the wind tried to steal. Jack carried her to the sled, his heart hardening against the cold as he realized the sheer scale of the community he was now trying to drag back from the edge of the void. Cooper's rear right leg began to fail him as they crossed the bridge toward the town registry. The shrapnel wound from years ago was flaring up in the sub-zero temperatures, causing the dog to stumble into a hidden snow pit. For a terrifying moment, the tether went taut, and Jack felt the dog being pulled toward a subterranean crevice. Jack lunged forward, his gloved fingers digging into the ice, and hauled the dog out by the harness. Cooper didn't whimper. He simply shook the snow from his chocolate coat, licked Jack's hand once, and resumed his low-crouched track. The dog was fighting his own war against the ice, his loyalty to Jack acting as a more powerful fuel than any caloric intake. They found more survivors, a group of terrified workers from the mill, and 2 children who had been hidden in a cast-iron bathtub, each one added to the lifeline tethered to Jack's harness. The procession of the broken and the frozen began the long, agonizing crawl back up the ridge toward the Devil's Hearth. The final ascent was the hardest. The wind was hitting the ridge with such force that it threatened to lift the entire line of survivors and hurl them into the Bitterroot Range. Jack moved in the lead, his boots finding the anchor points he had secretly installed weeks ago, steel rings bolted into the bedrock that no one else had noticed. He used these points to winch the group upward, a foot-by-foot battle against the gravity of the storm. Cooper stayed at the rear, nudging the stragglers, his presence a warm, barking encouragement for those who were ready to give up and let the sleep of the frost take them. The dog was limping heavily now, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he refused to fall behind. He was the shepherd of the lost, guarding the back of the line with a professional vigilance that made the terrified townspeople feel, for the first time in their lives, that the crazy soldier was the only ground that wasn't moving. When the steel hatch of the dome finally came into view, it looked like a moon rising in the dark. Jack hauled the last of the line through the threshold and slammed the 300-pound door shut, the triple locking cams engaging with a sound of absolute finality. The interior of the dome was suddenly a cathedral of warmth and light. Caleb Vance and Dave Briggs rushed forward to assist the frozen arrivals, guiding them down into the vast, hidden subterranean ward Jack had spent his life savings to build. As the townspeople of Clearcut descended into the warm, bunk-lined sanctuary, they saw the crates of medicine, the stacks of blankets, and the years of preparation Jack had hidden from them. Sarah Gable, Benner Grissom, and Nell Vane sat in the flickering light of the stove, the silence of the dome, a jarring contrast to the apocalypse they had just escaped. Jack collapsed onto a crate, his exoskeleton hissing as the power died, his scarred face a mask of exhaustion. Cooper limped over to him, his chocolate coat still matted with ice, and laid his heavy head on Jack's knee. The bizarre house was no longer a tomb or an insult to tradition. It was the only hearth left in the world. Jack Miller looked at the people who had hated him, and for the first time in Clearcut, he didn't feel like an outcast. He felt like a soldier who had finally brought his unit home. The interior of the dome was a cathedral of amber light and humming machinery, a stark, surreal sanctuary that felt as though it existed in a separate dimension from the apocalyptic frozen void screaming against its exterior. Down in the vast subterranean ward, the air was thick and sweet with the smell of wood smoke, sterilized bandages, and the rich, savory aroma of a massive pot of beef and lentil stew simmering atop the central multi-fuel stove. The 42 survivors of Clearcut, once the masters of their own square timber-built world, were now huddled together in the recessed bunks Jack Miller had carved into the concrete, their bodies swaddled in heavy wool blankets that smelled of cedar and military-grade detergent. The transition from the brink of death to this womb-like safety had left a haunting, hollow silence in the room, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the ventilation system and the muffled, distant roar of the polar vortex. Sarah Gable sat near the heat exchanger pipes, her sharp, bird-like frame looking fragile and diminished. Her ash-blonde hair, usually so perfectly bobbed, was matted with dried blood and ice, and her translucent skin was pale, save for the dark circles of exhaustion beneath her eyes. She watched Jack move through the circular chamber with a gaze that had shifted from sharp suspicion to a profound, bone-deep realization. She looked at the crates of high-calorie rations, the stacks of medicine, and the thermal bedding, and her thin lips trembled. Every cent they thought he was wasting, every hour they thought he was crazy, had been spent on their lives. The Devil's Hearth was not a tomb. It was the only hearth left in a world that had frozen over. Jack Miller moved like a ghost of pure mechanical purpose, his broad shoulders hunched as he ladled steaming bowls of stew from the industrial pot. He didn't offer grand speeches of forgiveness, or look for the vindication that he had clearly earned. He simply carried the heavy ceramic bowls to each person, his scarred, tape-wrapped hands steady despite the bone-deep fatigue that made his eyes sunken and flinty. When he reached Benner Old Ben Grissom, the man who had most vocally spearheaded the rumors against him, Jack didn't hesitate or sneer. He handed the bowl to the old Sawyer, whose bitter eyes were now wet with unshed tears of shame. Benner gripped the bowl as if it were a holy relic, the warmth of the ceramic thawing his frostbitten fingers. But his gaze remained fixed on the floorboards, unable to meet the eyes of the man he had tried to run out of town. Jack merely gave a single, solemn nod and moved on to the next bunk, his heavy boots making a dull, comforting sound on the concrete. He was a man in his final element, the commander of a lifeboat, providing the only thing that mattered in the face of annihilation: heat and sustenance. Helping him with the medical care was a new face in the sanctuary, Hannah Reed, the town's only registered nurse and a woman whose presence was as steady as a mountain. Hannah was 44, with a frame that was solid and dependable, her hair a thick silver-streaked chestnut braid that reached her waist. Her skin was tanned and rugged, the texture of fine linen, and her eyes were a piercing, practical blue that didn't miss a single detail of a patient's condition. Hannah was a woman who had seen the worst of Wyoming's accidents: logging mishaps, tractor rollovers, and frozen limbs. And her personality was a blend of clinical detachment and a fierce, mothering authority. She had been rescued from the wreckage of the local clinic, and now she moved alongside Jack, using the surgical-grade supplies he had stockpiled to treat the survivors. She watched Jack as he reset Tobias Vance's shattered arm with the practiced brutal efficiency of a field medic, her respect for him growing with every stitch he pulled. She noticed the way Jack ignored his own injuries, the cracked knuckles and the frost-nipped ears, to ensure that Nell Vane had the correct dosage of heart medication. Hannah realized that Jack wasn't just a soldier, he was a caretaker who had been preparing for a war of compassion. Cooper was the silent architect of the room's emotional warmth. The old chocolate Labrador mix, despite his own exhaustion and the flaring pain in his limping leg, didn't retreat to a corner to sleep. Instead, he moved with a slow, deliberate grace from bunk to bunk. He seemed to possess an instinctive radar for those suffering the most from the shock of the vortex. He found a young girl named Lily Thorne, Elias's saw-year-old granddaughter, who was shivering uncontrollably in a corner. Lily was a small, delicate child, with eyes like dark berries and golden curls that were now a tangled mess. Cooper didn't bark or nudge. He simply lay down beside her, his large, warm body acting as a living heater. He rested his graying muzzle on the edge of her blanket, his rhythmic breathing providing a steady, grounding pulse that gradually slowed the girl's frantic heartbeat. One by one, the terrified children and the elderly survivors reached out to touch his thick chocolate fur, finding in the Mind Dog a sense of peace that the storm could not touch. Cooper accepted their touch with a wise, amber-eyed gaze, a veteran who knew that the hardest part of any war was the silence that followed the explosion. The physical warmth of the dome began to melt the psychological ice that had gripped the community of Clearcut for months. Martha Vane, who had been found huddled in the sub-basement of the Thorn Mill alongside her brother Marcus, sat in a bunk near the ventilation shaft. Her raven-black ponytail was gone, replaced by a tattered wool wrap, and her sharp, judgmental lip was swollen and bruised. She looked around the circular sanctuary at the lack of straight lines and the absence of traditional timber, and for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of profound, terrifying humility. The square houses she had championed were now shrapnel in the wind, but the bizarre bowl she had called a monstrosity was the only thing holding the roof of the sky off their heads. Marcus sat beside her, his polished, athletic build now slumped and broken, his expensive leather gloves lost to the storm. He watched Jack Miller tending to the stove, his pride shattered by the realization that the crazy soldier had understood the physics of their valley better than any contractor with a degree. The arrogance of the Vane family had been scoured away by the vortex, leaving only the raw, shivering truth of their shared humanity. Jack Koi Kung sat down near the stove, his first moment of rest since the storm began. He didn't eat. He simply watched the survivors, his scarred jaw finally relaxing as he saw the color returning to their faces. He pulled a small, tattered notebook from his canvas jacket, the same one Caleb Vance had seen him sketching in, and looked at the list of names he had written there weeks ago. He had checked off nearly everyone he had set out to find, he had transformed his isolation into a communal victory, turning the ridge of Devil's Hearth into a sanctuary for the very people who had cast him out. Beside him sat a man Caleb hadn't noticed before, Reverend Silas Thorne, a cousin of Elias, the town's spiritual leader. Silas was a man of 70 with a voice like velvet and a beard that reached his chest, a personality defined by a deep, quiet faith that had been tested by the sheer violence of the vortex. He looked at Jack, then at the dome, and then at the 42 souls breathing because of one man's foresight. He didn't offer a prayer of salvation. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, a silent gesture of atonement and gratitude. "You built a circle, Jack," the Reverend whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "and you brought the whole world inside it." Jack looked into the fire, the orange light reflecting in his flinty eyes, and for the first time since he had stepped off that Greyhound bus, the ghosts of the desert seemed to go quiet. The polar vortex continued to scream outside, a wall of white death trying to find a way in, but inside the roundhouse, the hearts of Clearcut were beating together, warmed by a fire that no storm could extinguish, the selfless soul of a veteran who refused to leave anyone behind in the dark. The silence that followed the departure of the polar vortex was more profound than any sound Jack Miller had ever heard in his 46 years of survival. It was a heavy, crystalline stillness that felt as though the world had been held underwater and finally allowed to breathe. As the first pale, golden threads of the Wyoming dawn began to pierce the bruised violet horizon, Jack moved toward the steel hatch, his body a map of exhaustion, but his spirit anchored by a strange, newfound peace. He spun the heavy iron wheel, the triple cams disengaging with a soft, metallic click that echoed through the circular sanctuary where 42 souls had found their salvation. When the door swung open, the air that rushed in was no longer a lethal vacuum, but a crisp, life-giving chill that smelled of ancient ice and distant pines. Jack stepped out onto the polished concrete apron of the ridge, followed closely by Cooper, whose gray muzzle was lifted to the morning light, his amber eyes reflecting the transformation of the world. The valley of Clearcut below was unrecognizable, a graveyard of timber and tradition, where the square houses had been ground into kindling by the vortex. Yet, as the survivors began to emerge from the hatch behind him, blinking in the unaccustomed light, there were no cries of despair. Instead, there was a collective, ragged breath of gratitude. They stood atop the Devil's Hearth, looking down at the ruins of their old lives, but for the first time in Clearcut's history, the lines between outcast and neighbor had been scoured away by the wind, leaving only a community bound by the strength of a curve. The reconstruction of the valley began not with a blueprint, but with an apology that carried the weight of a mountain. Marcus Vane, the once arrogant contractor whose fleet of trucks had been scattered like toys across the landscape, stood before Jack in the melting snow, his polished jawline now rugged with a week's worth of stubble. He didn't offer a handshake, he offered a bow of profound, silent respect. The town council, led by a humbled Sarah Gable and the weary sheriff Roy Wade, convened in the center of the dome's subterranean ward. They looked at the ruins of their square world, and then at the monolithic sphere that had remained unbroken, and they made a decision that would redefine the Bitterroot Range for generations. They formally requested Jack Miller to serve as the chief architect of the new Clearcut, a settlement that would be built not for the aesthetics of the past, but for the survival of the future. To assist with this transition, a new figure arrived from the state capital via a National Guard relief convoy, Ewan Thorne, a distant cousin of Elias and a high-ranking urban development specialist. Ewan was 42, with a sharp analytical mind and a frame that was lean and wiry, dressed in high-tech mountain gear that looked out of place among the wood shavings of the mill. He had thinning chestnut hair and wore gold-rimmed spectacles that sat atop a nose that seemed perpetually pointed toward a data sheet. Ewan was a man of logic and systems, a personality defined by a quiet, intense curiosity about how things worked under pressure. When he saw Jack's dome, he didn't call it bizarre. He called it the most efficient structural solution in the Western Hemisphere. Under Jack's guidance and Ewan's administrative support, the town began to rise again, this time as a cluster of interconnected monolithic domes, a village of circles designed to let the wind slide by. The physical labor of rebuilding Jack's own land became a communal ritual of atonement. The men who had once dumped cement bags in the snow now spent their weekends on the ridge of Devil's Hearth, their muscular frames moving in harmony with Jack's commands as they expanded the bizarre house into a proper homestead. They built a wide circular porch of reclaimed cedar that wrapped around the entire dome, a place where the community could gather without the fear of the sky falling. Tobias Vance and Old Ben Grissom, the men who had most vocally mocked Jack, were the ones who spent 48 hours straight hand-carving a massive ornate front door from a single slab of ancient oak, featuring a relief of a Labrador mix standing guard atop a mountain. They didn't just build a porch, they built a legacy. They reinforced the ridge with stone terraces, planting winter-hardy shrubs that Nell Vane had preserved in her greenhouse, turning the barren rock into a garden of resilience. Jack no longer worked in the shadows of the seasoning shed at the lumber mill. He worked on his own porch, his scarred hands now moving over high-quality drafting paper as he taught the younger generation, including a devoted Caleb Vance, the principles of aerodynamic load and the integrity of the arch. Cooper's status in the town underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. He was no longer the limping mutt or the broken toy. He was the guardian of the ridge, a four-legged hero whose instincts were celebrated in every household of the new valley. The townspeople, led by a grateful Lily Thorne, pooled their resources to create a special sanctuary for the old dog. They built a custom-designed, heated kennel pod attached to the main dome, lined with the softest sheepskin and equipped with an automated feeding system that Jack had designed. Every afternoon, children would hike up the ridge not to stare at the madman, but to bring Cooper organic treats and to sit by his side as he sunned himself on the cedar porch. The dog accepted their attention with a quiet, sage-like dignity, his rhythmic limp now seen as a badge of honor, a testament to the battles he had fought so that they could all have a tomorrow. Cooper had become the soul of the new Clearcut, a living reminder that the most valuable things in the world were often those that had been damaged and then made stronger by the repair. As the first year after the polar vortex came to a close, the Valley of Clearcut had become a beacon of modern survivalism, a circular city that drew visitors from across the country to witness the miracle of the Bitterroots. But on the ridge of Devil's Hearth, life remained simple and profound. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and the sky turned a soft, peaceful amber, a group of neighbors would gather at Jack's house for a communal meal. Clara Thorne and Hannah Reed would bring pots of thick, savory stew, and they would sit together on the circular porch, sharing stories that were no longer poisoned by gossip. Jack Miller sat at the head of the table, his oil-stained canvas jacket replaced by a warm wool sweater Sarah Gable had knitted for him, his flinty blue eyes now holding a warmth that matched the flickering light of the lanterns. He had found a family not in the desert and not in the solitude of his Lam Lee years, but in the hearts of the very people who had once cast him out. He had proven that the greatest strength of a soldier wasn't his ability to kill, but his capacity to protect and forgive. The story of the bizarre house reached its final, perfect cadence on a crisp October evening. Jack sat in his rocking chair on the porch, his hand resting on the thick chocolate fur of Cooper's neck, as the old dog slept soundly at his feet. Below them, the valley was dotted with dozens of glowing white domes, looking like a cluster of pearls scattered across the Wyoming landscape. There were no more white fences, no more steep-pitched roofs to act as hammers, and no more traditional vulnerabilities. There were only circles, strong, inclusive, and unbreakable. Jack looked at Caleb Vance, who was sitting on the steps studying a set of structural engineering manuals, and he saw the future of a world that was no longer afraid of the wind. He realized then that his scars were no longer maps of pain, but marks of a journey that had led him exactly where he was meant to be. He wasn't a drifter anymore, he was the foundation. The wind began to rise, a gentle autumn breeze that whispered through the pines, and as it hit the smooth, polished surface of the dome, it simply slid away, unable to find a single edge to tear. Jack leaned back, the orange light of the sunset reflecting in his eyes, and closed his eyes in the absolute beautiful silence of a man who was finally, truly home. The story of Jack Miller and his dog Cooper is more than a tale of survival. It is a profound journey of forgiveness and silent faith. Jack chose to answer hostility with grace, using his scars and his solitude to secretly build a sanctuary for the very people who shunned him. Through this, we realize that true strength does not reside in sharp angles or outward appearances, but in the steadfast heart of a protector. the circular dome became a symbol of unconditional love, a reminder that even those of us who are broken can become the safest harbor for others. In a world that often tries to cast us out, let kindness be your blueprint, for when the storms of life arrive, it is our sincere connection to one another that remains the only structure that cannot be broken. A message from the heart. Dear friends, in our daily lives, we often encounter the bizarre houses or the silent Jack Millers of the world. Do not judge too quickly, for they may be the very miracles God has quietly sent to test our compassion. God does not always appear in brilliant light. He often resides in the quiet persistence of a veteran and the unwavering loyalty of a dog. Jack's dome is a testament to divine protection. When the world around us crumbles, it is our spiritual preparation and the quality of our souls that stand firm. Build your own circle today. A circle with no corners for hatred, only space for understanding and mercy. Join us in spreading this miracle. Comment, share a kindness you've received or an act of love you wish to perform today. Share. Send this video to someone who is currently facing their own storm. Subscribe. Join our community to ensure you never miss an inspiring journey. May God bless you with peace in your heart and strengthen your soul. May you and your loved ones always be sheltered in His infinite love and light. Amen.